You've probably heard this rumor floating around the internet, right? This persistent myth that lobsters are immortal, that somewhere deep in the cold, dark ocean, there are these creatures that just don't die of old age. It's a wild idea, but is there any truth to it? Okay, let's dive in and find out. So, that's the big question we're tackling here. Are they actually biologically immortal? And the answer? Well, it's not a simple yes or no. It's actually a journey into cellular biology, some surprising mechanical engineering, and a really deep paradox that defines the lobster's entire existence. All right, so to really get to the bottom of this, we've got to unpack the science behind this whole myth. I mean, what does it even mean for an animal to be ageless? Okay, so the fancy scientific term for what lobsters have is negligible senescence. Now, this is super important. It's not immortality, not even close. It simply means they don't die of old age. Their risk of dying from internal biological problems doesn't go up as they get older. But, and this is a huge but, they are absolutely vulnerable to predators, disease, and, as we're about to see, a fatal flaw in their own design. And looking at this really helps put the lobster's strategy into perspective. See, most of us, humans included, are on this path called Gumpersian senescence. Our risk of death just skyrockets as we age. But lobsters? They're on this totally different track, where their risk just stays flat. And then you have the real outliers, the truly biologically immortal, like the Hydra, which are playing a whole different ballgame of rejuvenation.
So you gotta wonder, how does this ageless engine even work? What's the secret happening down at the cellular level that lets a lobster just sidestep the whole aging process that gets the rest of us?
Well, for most of us, the problem boils down to our chromosomes. And the best way to think about it is with this shoelace analogy. You know those little plastic tips at the end? They're called eyeglets. Well, our DNA has something similar called telomeres, and they protect all that vital genetic information. But here's the catch. Every single time one of our cells divides, those tips get just a little bit shorter, a little more worn out.
And you can see the whole countdown right here. A young cell starts out with these nice, long telomeres, but with each division, they shrink. And eventually, they get so short that the cell hits a wall. It's called the Hayflick limit. It just can't divide anymore. And that, in a nutshell, is cellular aging. It's the root cause of wrinkles, healing slower, all the stuff we think of as getting old. But the lobster has a solution. A biological superpower, really. It's an enzyme, and it's called telomerase. And its job is incredibly simple, but also profound. It rebuilds those fraying telomeres. It basically resets the cellular clock every single time a cell divides.
Now here's the crazy part. We, humans, we pretty much shut down telomerase activity after we're born, except in a few special cells. But lobsters, they keep it running everywhere, all the time. In their heart, their muscles, their skin, telomerase is constantly on the job, repairing and rebuilding. This is the secret sauce. This is what keeps their insides from ever really getting old. And the result of all this in the real world is, well, it's just astounding. Instead of getting weaker and more frail with age, older lobsters become absolute titans. They never stop growing, they just keep getting bigger, stronger, and believe it or not, more fertile with every passing year. And just look at the impact this has on reproduction. It's insane. A young female might pop out around, say, 50,000 eggs, but a huge old matriarch, what scientists call a superbreeder, can produce nearly 500,000. These old-timers are absolutely vital for the health of the entire population. They just completely flip the script on the normal rules of aging. Okay, but here's where the story takes a really dramatic turn. Because the very thing that makes the lobster so incredibly powerful, this ability to grow forever, is also, tragically, the source of its ultimate downfall. This is the lobster's paradox. So the main takeaway here is this. A lobster's cells might be ageless, but its body is definitely not immortal. It has a mechanical limit, a built-in Achilles heel. And that Achilles heel? It's molting. You see, to get bigger, a lobster has no choice but to literally crack open its hard shell and pull its entire, soft, vulnerable body out. This process, called ecdysis, is without a doubt the single most dangerous thing a lobster will ever do. And as a lobster gets bigger and older, molting becomes exponentially harder and more dangerous. The energy it takes is just immense. Scientists estimate that something like 10 to 15% of lobsters die just from exhaustion trying to do it. They can get stuck halfway out, Or if they do make it, they're so soft and weak that they're easy pickings for predators. Every single molt is a battle against increasingly terrible odds.
And then, eventually, a very old, very large lobster reaches a point where it just can't summon the energy for one more molt. It gets trapped in what's called a permanent intermolt. Its eternally youthful body is now stuck inside a decaying prison it can no longer escape.
And this is how a lobster actually dies. Not from its organs failing due to old age, but from pure mechanical failure. Its shell, which it can no longer replace, starts to degrade and crack. Bacteria that literally eat shell material begin to move in, causing nasty infections. Eventually, its own skeleton, its house, just fails. It's a really grim end, and it's dictated not by biology, but by physics.
And as if that natural life cycle wasn't tough enough, modern environmental pressures are making life even harder for these ancient survivors, basically speeding up the clock to that final fatal molt. One of the biggest new threats is something called epigenetic shell disease. It's a bacterial infection that literally eats away at the lobster's shell. And it's a huge problem for older lobsters because they don't molt as often, which gives the bacteria way more time to do its damage. And here's the number that really matters: 20 degrees Celsius. That's about 68 Fahrenheit. Research shows that as soon as the water gets warmer than that, shell disease just explodes, both in how common it is and how severe it gets. And thanks to climate change, those warmer temperatures are happening more and more often. So what you end up with is this perfect storm of stress. On one hand, intense fishing is pulling all those big vital superbreeders out of the water. And on the other, the warming oceans are messing with the lobster's metabolism, forcing them to molt more often when they're young, which just racks up the risk over their lifetime. So after all that, what are the big takeaways? What does the lobster's strange, paradoxical life really teach us about longevity and, well, life itself? Well, for one thing, it shows us there's more than one way to cheat death. The lobster, it uses this sort of high-performance maintenance strategy. It's constantly repairing its own complex body. Then you've got something like the hydra, which basically just replaces old parts with brand new stem cells. And then there's the immortal jellyfish, which can literally hit the cosmic reset button and go back to being a baby. They're all different evolutionary solutions to the same fundamental problem of aging. And that leaves us with one last pretty deep question to chew on. The lobster's agelessness is ultimately trapped by a physical problem. That shell it just can't escape. Its greatest strength becomes its fatal flaw. So as we, as humans, chase our own ways of extending life, you have to wonder, what unforeseen paradoxes, what hidden costs might be waiting for us down the road?